He's trapped as well.
And theirs as well.
Well, it's finally here, Beyond Citadel, the sequel to the 2020 first-person shooter, The Citadel, a self-described love letter to Marathon, Doom, and Wolfenstein 3D. And if you played that original game, well, then you can probably give an educated guess on what to expect this time around. That being lots of violent, murderous chaos as you inflict grievous bodily harm on a bunch of cutesy anime girls in a dystopian future. Yeah, just my kind of game. I've been pretty hyped for this thing for a while now. In fact, ever since I first played that early demo that Doka Amore released last year, and since then quite a lot of content's been added into this final build, with there being a hell of a lot to get through, with the campaign alone easily taking anywhere from 6 to 8 hours to finish, along with all the side modes and other content to find. And yeah, if nothing else, I guarantee you'll not have played anything like this before, outside the prequel, especially not in recent memory. Because much like the first game, Beyond Citadel is a weird, surreal experience that's hard to follow at the best of times, a lot of which is carried by its unique art style and aesthetic. It's no secret that anime and gratuitous violence go hand in hand, as a lot of the stuff I watched as a kid can probably attest to. But once again, let me do my best to try to explain what's actually going on here, so all of you lovely people can decide whether or not it's worth your hard-earned dollary dues. Also too, this year, I'm really trying to reach that 1,000,000 sub mark, so it'd mean a lot to me if you could help me out on that journey and hit that subscribe button. Sound good? Alright, let's get into it. Now, I will say off the bat that it has been a while since I played that first game, so forgive me if I'm misremembering certain aspects or features, but the way that I remember it is that the premise is the martyr is returning from the first game, after having defeated the sleeping god. Woken up this time after receiving some kind of distress signal, which sends her to a sanctuary where the 7 angels from the first game are now residing. With that really being the key number here too, because this time you're going after 7 demons in 7 different zones to try and reclaim 7 different artifacts, which are all fragments that need to be combined to prevent some kind of apocalypse. And yeah, like I guess another apocalypse after that original one that wiped out 99% of humanity and caused all of the remaining survivors to become violent cyborgs. What little exposition we get this time is delivered through written dialogue with various NPCs, along with these short intermission sequences that only give vague details as to this relationship between the martyr and her brother. Yeah, the kind of relationship that would very quickly get a YouTube channel demonetized even talking about it. And yeah, and it's also the kind of game where when you look at the ground, you see this.
Check this out.
Anyway, all you really need to know is that there's 7 different demons who all need to be killed, and it's up to the martyr to make sure that happens. With the whole thing not really differing all that much from the gameplay in the first game, just being your standard first-person shooter, with a combination of 2D sprites and 3D environments, where you run, jump, double jump, high jump, collect keys, and murder everything that gets in your way. Along with your health bar, there's also an oxygen and hunger bar to keep your eye on as well. You use blood bags to top up your health, you vape on O2 canisters to restore your oxygen, and then chow down on Soylent Green so you don't starve to death. Every level's got a virtue shrine which offers up a crucial player upgrade, all of which correspond to the 7 deadly sins like pride, greed, envy, and paying for Twitter, which all then give different benefits to the martyr like more health points, faster movement speed, or reduced weapon recoil. And by the end of the story, if you've found all of them, you'll have maxed out every single category, making the whole thing a hell of a lot easier, not to mention just proving you're a certified gamer. Beyond Citadel, however, also adds in a few new tricks on top of those ones as well. Like eventually you'll find an air dash move, which is pretty handy, though I do think just a basic ground dash would have been great too. Then on top of that, you've got temporary upgrades like breathing underwater, used for the 2 or so instances in the entire game when you actually need to go swimming, as well as for all these final epilogue sequences inside these abstract levels, which involve a whole heap of wall running, something that you never need to do once outside of these stages, really making it this weird one-off mechanic that you very quickly need to get the hang of, but that never comes up again. And much like the first game, levels are quite flexible in the way that they let you explore your surroundings, just in the way that you can often climb up to the top of these different structures and use them as an easy way to move around the map. Oh yeah, and this time as well, when you fall off a ledge, instead of dying, you just appear back on the nearest platform, none the worse for wear.
That's a good idea.
Along with all the new moves, you've now got 3 different armor types to equip as well. There's one designed for mobility and less protection, there's one that's a literal juggernaut suit, and then there's one that's balanced around both. As well as there just being different suits for the martyr, a lot of which look like they offer up about as much protection as a piece of dental floss, but can somehow still reduce the damage you take by up to 50%. So it's kind of like it's really letting you choose if you want to be this hulking juggernaut, literally stomping through the levels, or a more mobile and athletic warrior that's better at evading attacks. Either way though, despite which one you go with, this is still at its core a shooter first and foremost. And there is still something just undeniably appealing about all the gore and violence. The way that you're fighting all these enemies decked out head to toe in complete body armor, only to then destroy this armored exterior and see these cutesy anime characters underneath, whose eyes are rolled back into their head as they're in the throes of an extremely painful death. Some of the violence does appear to be toned down a bit though, which might just be because of the insane backlash the developer got with that first game. And I mean, just compare how the grenade kills look as an example. Also, I did notice that those ear-piercing screams you'd often hear from the killed cultists in the first game are also reduced as well. Still though, there is no shortage of things to kill here, and all up, there's quite a lot of guns as well. With there being over a dozen in total, really making it feel like I'm playing some kind of weapon pack for Doom or something. A lot of which are returning from the first game. You again start off with the Martyr's Axe, which ain't too bad as far as damage goes, it's just that getting in close to melee enemies is more or less suicide. And it quickly gets replaced with a pistol, the shotgun, and the carbine rifle. All of these weapons then fall into their own category, be it pistols and revolvers, rifles, shotguns, or missile launchers. And there's not always a right or wrong weapon to go with. Like with the pistols and revolvers for instance, there's benefits to both the pistol and the magnum each. Never really feeling like one of them is outright cancelling the other one out. Pistol's a good fallback weapon to have on hand if you've ever got to clear out groups of those weaker enemies, whereas the magnum's higher damage output makes it really effective against even the tougher ones. Same thing with the carbine rifle and the heavy machine gun, which also share the same slot. I mean, the carbine is still without a doubt one of the most effective guns in the entire game, able to kill almost every standard enemy in a single headshot. But then that heavy machine gun is also kinda hard to ignore, given that it chews through ammo faster than your mum chews through morning after pills. And it's got a really powerful alternate fire mode that fires out missiles. Yeah, truly as well, one of the all-time best FPS weapon combos, the old machine gun and rocket or grenade launching alt fire. With some of the other weapons though, I do think there is a superior option. Like with the shotguns for instance, you've got a standard pump action which you get your hands on very early into the game, and is pretty effective at close range. But it's easily beaten out by that automatic variant called the shock hammer, not to be confused with the shocker. Not only do you not need to load in a new shell after every shot, but this thing can hold up to 10 shells at once. And as for the reloading, well, that can be done as fast as you can press the button. Very early on in the game, you'll also find the Storm Rifle, which is a bullpup assault rifle that seems to be pretty good. Only it's also soon massively outclassed by the returning Machine Rifle, which not only uses the same bullets, but again has that outright broken alternate fire mode that sends out a literal laser pointer that just melts through enemies in nanoseconds. And then with the submachine gun, which you again get quite early in the game, it's ultimately replaced by this thing that I don't even really know how to describe. I mean, I guess it's kind of like a minigun or something that fires out ammo much quicker and has a near instantaneous reload.
This is better.
I still do think it's worth playing around with all of the guns though, like even the ones that aren't that useful, simply because the sprite work for almost all of these is really good. And I might just be turning into a bit of a hipster, but there's just something about these hand-drawn sprites over 3D modeling that I'm always going to appreciate. Grenades make a return as well, and are still really handy at dealing with groups of slower moving enemies, along with those annoying gun emplacements. And the remote detonators are also back as well, and again a super effective way to take out tanks or the mech suits. The only weapon I just didn't really find myself using all that much was the whale gun, mostly because it just didn't seem to do that much damage to justify how slow it was to fire and reload. Especially when I could just circle strafe around with the shotgun or the machine gun and mow everything down in a fraction of the time. Though I will say that it's kinda nice that they decided to add in a weapon named after your mum. It's kind of easy to forget too that every weapon has an alternate fire mode, because most of the time you really can get by with just shooting people in the traditional sense. Like that submachine gun, for instance, has a ballistic shield you can pull up to reduce incoming damage, joining the ranks of games like Urban Chaos and Crisis Zone as strong contenders for why we need riot shield mechanics in much more games. A lot of these are actually gate kept within this whole weapon modification system too, where you can upgrade these guns even further, like adding a tactical scope to the assault rifles or cluster rockets to the missile launchers. The pistol gets an alternate fire mode that lets it fire full auto along with an extended mag, and for the Magnum you can add in a burst fire mode, which makes it even more powerful. As well as being able to launch out a grenade right from the barrel. But what we really need to talk about is how this game handles weapon reloading, because this is going to make it a vastly different experience, I think, for each person playing. Right, so by default, Beyond Citadel has this system where to reload a weapon, you first need to manually remove the magazine, at which point the bullets are added into the magazine itself, before you then reinsert the magazine and charge the gun before it's ready to fire. And then for single weapons like the shotguns and the rifles, you also need to pump it in between each shot. Then you can do something called a fast reload, dropping a magazine on the ground and putting in a spare one if you've got it. And this is a lot quicker, but there's also a chance that that dropped magazine is going to be destroyed because, I don't know, I guess they're made out of glass. The alternative to all of this is just a more traditional approach, where you simply press the R button and the weapon's reloaded in a matter of seconds. And you're able to toggle back and forth between any of these whenever you want in the options menu.
That's a good idea.
Now, early on, the whole unloading and loading magazines manually system does work pretty well, because those first few levels are smaller to medium-sized interior maps, where you're only taking on like 1 or 2 enemies at a time. And at this point, it really feels almost tactical, letting you lean around corners and stuff like that, really accommodating that slower and more methodical approach to this whole reloading system, which is also too why I really enjoyed that mechanic for what it was when I played that demo. The thing is though, later on in the game when the levels are far more opened up and the enemy count is a lot higher, I just don't think this kind of approach really works. Because when you got like a couple of dozen enemies firing at you at once, you don't really want to be worrying about making sure you've done the 2 or 3 steps required just to simply fire your weapon in the first place. I mean, at this point, it's basically like you're playing Quake or something, you know what I mean? Double jumping and air dashing around. And it just doesn't really suit that whole premise of having to manually reload your magazines. Not to mention, you've also got the chance of having your weapons jamming. Yeah, because the more you use these guns, the more they're going to degrade, making them more susceptible to jam up during a gunfight. What also kind of pisses me off about this whole jamming mechanic is that it never seems to apply to the enemies, who can fire on you constantly without it ever happening. This is something that a lot of other games are also guilty of. In fact, I remember playing Far Cry 2 back in the day, where it even pulled the same shit as well. Where you'd pick up someone else's gun and then the thing would jam in like 3 fucking seconds, despite the enemy having fired it at you for 5 minutes prior with it working perfectly. Even the recent Stalker 2 is guilty of the same thing, where you'd pick up someone's rifle with it being about 4 or 5 shots away from falling apart. And I just think that in this instance with Beyond Citadel, as neat as that idea is, it just doesn't quite work with that overall flow of the combat. It'll be like playing through Doom Eternal and halfway through a chainsaw kill, you've suddenly got to stop to replace the blades. The only real downside to turning this feature off is that it also removes the concept of weapons breaking down, which makes one of those upgrade categories completely redundant. But I don't really think there's a right or wrong way to go here. And if you do want to spend the extra time meticulously reloading all your weapons, then yeah, go for it. But it really does do wonders for the flow of the combat if you go for that more traditional approach. So I don't know, like maybe give each one a try and see which one tickles your balls the most. Now the campaign itself is broken down into those 7 different chapters or acts, each of which have like a prologue level, then 4 standard levels followed by a boss fight, and then like a bit of an intermission or epilogue before you return to the sanctuary and can head on to the next one. with each act also having like a different visual theme, but still all of them sharing the same enemy types and mostly the same level design templates as well. And that's really, I think, my main complaint about the campaign here, is that it just never really builds up to anything super exciting, because it feels like most of the levels are just the same formula repeated over and over. It's kind of like it shows its colors very early on and then doesn't really do that much to delineate from any of it. It's mostly just key hunting and flipping switches. I mean, occasionally you might have to find a bunch of batteries to power up a locked door or something, but it just never really managed to consistently surprise me in an interesting way. I will say though that there is a sense of some variety. Like, there's a couple of levels where you get to drive around in a tank. And once I got used to the controls for this thing, it was a nice departure from being on foot all the time. Now this thing has a couple of different firing modes, as well as a machine gun with infinite ammo, and you're able to pretty easily mow down all the basic enemies, as well as even demolishing enemy tanks, so yeah, it's pretty awesome.
Rocket launcher!
Like the first game, there's a couple of levels too where you get to control a mech suit, which has a built-in jetpack making navigation even easier. And this right here is without a doubt some of the most fun I had in the entire game, simply because you're pretty much unstoppable when you're inside one of these things. It also kind of dawned on me as well here that I can't think of a single time where we had a mech suit in an FPS game which wasn't awesome to play as. Then one of the later levels as you hopping into what's more or less like a jet, which is equipped with, yet again, missiles and a machine gun, even letting you hop out whenever you want to explore the nearby buildings. And this is the kind of stuff that the campaign just really needed more of. Because outside of that, I just don't feel like the developers really improved his skill all that much since the first game in terms of the level design. And everything still looks very drab and monotone, with there virtually being no depth or variation to even the lighting. The levels are still very square and rectangular in appearance, being very grid-based and mathematical. And I know that in some ways that's a deliberate tonal choice given the whole transhuman cybernetic premise of the story, but it still doesn't change the fact that things look really antiquated. And just because a game is taking the same design principles of something made way back in the 1990s, it doesn't mean that it also can't evolve and improve upon those in its own unique ways. I mean, look, like, I'm not trying to heap shit on the developer, and it's still a massive undertaking and achievement considering it's been accomplished by mostly one person. Also, I do think the $20 they're asking for is just the right price point, given the amount of game time you're getting overall. But I guess I just wish for a bit more variety or surprises so far as the levels were concerned. Especially because it seems the general approach here is to just place as many random enemies in the levels as possible. Now in that regard, Beyond Citadel really excels during those levels set inside the interior areas, where you can easily break line of sight and peek around corners. However, it's during these more opened up environments where it all just kinda goes to shit, because enemies are often able to just pepper you with gunfire from literally the other side of the map. It does help that the guns aren't actually hit scanning, instead clearly being projectile based, which at the very least means if you're constantly moving, you're not gonna get hit as much. But it's really hard to not find these kind of environments just irritating to play through. Especially when the levels put enemies high up on ledges or on the top of buildings where they can basically just fire on you uninterrupted. By far the worst levels in that regard are the ones where you've got a bunch of snipers to deal with. Because for all of these, until you hunt them down and kill them, you're going to have this annoying beeping sound effect playing over and over. Which I guess is supposed to be a helpful audio cue to let you know when they're locking on, but it's really just this annoying grating effect, which feels like someone's tapping into my ear canal with a metal chopstick. But yeah, and speaking of enemy sound effects, there's a few floating ones here which have the most annoying sound effect I think I've ever heard. It's like this high-pitched humming, which you can even hear when they're not in the room, and it just got so fucking irritating, to the point that I usually ended up just turning the sound down, if not completely off.
That noise. That's the noise!
I also can't shake the feeling of the level design really relying on putting all of these tougher, spongier enemies in there to increase the challenge, especially later on where they just keep throwing more and more of these things at the player. And fighting these things isn't difficult so much as just time consuming and kinda tedious. Half the time I just ended up running right past them and avoiding them completely, if the game allowed me to. Because it's also quite fun to putting these guys in small rooms where you've got fuck all room to maneuver. As for the boss fights, well, there's quite a lot of weird shit going on with these things as well. Thematically, these are all an antithesis to the 7 deadly sins. So to counter gluttony, for instance, you've got the demon of temperance. And then for sloth, you've got the demon of diligence. So if nothing else, it's absolutely on brand and keeping it with the whole running theme the game's got of following this biblical and religious overtone. It's when it comes down to fighting them when it gets a bit interesting. Now, at the start of these, you're always given some kind of super overpowered angelic weapon, which then really makes the fight itself easy as piss. I mean, for one of them as an example, you've got these fast-firing bullet gloves that may as well have infinite ammo, and you can just fire constantly with these things until the demon dies. Then for one of the other ones, it's a missile launcher you can similarly spam over and over without ever having to worry about running out of spare ammunition. So it's kind of like the boss fights more exist for a narrative and thematic purpose, more than they're supposed to be super challenging or difficult. And you'll probably beat all of these on your first attempt with little to no drama. The same, however, can't be said for the first boss, which is the complete opposite. Because for this fight, you're given a minigun, which sounds fine, only when you're firing this thing, you're instead moving at a goddamn snail's pace. And as well as that, this boss keeps spawning in more of the basic soldiers to attack you, where it got to the point that the only way I was able to beat this thing was to exploit its giant hitbox and shoot it from around cover. Or as someone else pointed out online, you can simply run in with one of the melee weapons and kill it in a single hit. Where, according to the health bar, I did over 1.5 million points of damage, which, yeah, I highly doubt was the intended strategy. Same thing later on too when you get the same minigun against another boss. And the only way to effectively kill this thing without getting obliterated was to just find a spot where its attacks couldn't hit me, while I fired back unhindered. And I do want to point out the irony of this thing being named the Demon of Patience, where the strategy for beating it is to just hold down the left mouse button for like 60 seconds.
Come on, while we're young.
Kinda harkens back to the first game, which also had similar problems when it came to how these bosses played out. Where you've got these humongous, terrifying looking entities you've got to destroy, all of which has symbolic and narrative meanings, only for the fight itself to be a bit of a clusterfuck. It's just all the result, I think, of what happens when someone makes an entire game without really getting that much feedback or criticism along the way. And look, like, it's not like you have to release a game into early access. I mean, people should be allowed to make the game they want to. That much is true. But I just feel like at least a bit of player feedback in regards to some of these aspects really would have been a godsend, and really helped to make Beyond Citadel go from being very good to very great. Know what I'm saying? Now, the last few final aspects to this thing is the New Game Plus mode, as well as finding all those various virtue shrines and additional artwork. Yeah, and again, the kind of artwork between the martyr and her ambiguously aged-looking sibling that would very quickly get this video demonetized. Finally, aside from that, you've got 8 extra levels to complete as well, which are shorter but more challenging one-off maps, where the goal is to find one of 8 whetstones, which are supposed to improve the damage your melee weapons do. But along with that, it also gives you some genuinely effective upgrades, like ones that double how much ammo and gold you get from pickups, or even one that doubles your ammo capacity entirely, kinda like the backpack in Doom. And my only complaint here is that the game didn't put more of an importance on how necessary these upgrades were, considering I found myself struggling for ammo for pretty much the entire campaign. And I didn't actually even realize I could play through these extra levels until I'd beaten the whole thing. There's also other like hidden features in there as well, like one where you can leave the sanctuary and walk about in this desert area, even coming across a nearby inn, with there being this busty innkeeper who even sells you tea, along with an interface where you can modify enemy parameters to make them weaker. And I'm not sure if stuff like this is being deliberately vague, but either way, for the most part, I didn't even know some of this stuff existed. And I only found out about it by messing around after I'd beaten the main story. But you know what? In some ways, I think that's more of a positive than a negative. And I still will say that despite all the issues, Beyond Citadel is a wildly unique and bizarre experience, which really should be played by anyone who's actually a fan of this genre. I'm happy to overlook a lot of otherwise glaring faults in indie games, given the conditions these were often made with, and doubly so when the developer team is as small as it is here. And at the end of the day, they've made the game they want. I mean, this is very clearly someone's personal vision, and you've got to respect that. I mean, yeah, like it's far from perfect, and it maybe drags on a bit too long for its own good at times, but they've still managed to deliver something that's one of a kind, or I don't know, one of a pair. And still, any game that lets me look down at the ground at any time and get a good old gander at some of the thickest thighs to ever grace the genre is still an easy recommendation for me at the end of the day.